Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are doing well. Thank you for joining us for this discussion related to these four horses in the book of Revelation. And there was no original plan to discuss these four horses. However, once we started down the road looking at this pale horse, and some questions came up, it seemed appropriate to go ahead and examine this entire four horses dynamic. Now, with respect to these four horses, it's a little deceptive because some of the descriptions in English don't comport with the descriptions in the Greek. And then, of course, you have these Latin translations. But what we have when looking at this are these four horses, and there is one horse that is identified as a white horse. One is identified as a red horse, but when deconstructing this type of red, it's really a fire horse. And so it's that type of red. And so it's not the red that is indicated in the English. Then there is a black horse. And of course, we've discussed briefly this green horse. And so we're going to deconstruct exactly what is stated related to these different horses. And we are going to examine not just the horses, but what the horses are bringing according to the narrative, what the horses are carrying. So to start off, this entire dynamic is related to what is known as the apocalypse. And we've talked about the apocalypse before, this construct of an apocalypse. And so we're going to just quickly look into this whole idea of an apocalypse to get a better understanding of what's supposed to be going on in this very unique book known as this book of Revelation. Now, many people act as if they really understand this book of Revelation, this very cryptic writing. This writing is full of what we've referred to before as mysterion. And so there is a lot of cryptic stuff going on in here, a lot of confusion. Basically, it's a very chaotic piece of writing, and it doesn't exactly hang together with the rest of the New Testament. However, it does look like it is picking pieces of scripture from various places. Okay, so with respect to this apocalypse, the apocalypse is another way of saying revelation, disclosing something, hence the book of Revelation. It's referring to uncovering something, disclosing, revealing something that was previously covered. Now, what's interesting about this also is that whole idea of covering and concealing is related to the construct of hell. And so it's just interesting that there's this construct that we are dealing with, which is the uncovering. And so with respect to this apocalypse, we have this dynamic of something being taken away. And so sort of the scales falling from the eyes with respect to the narrative that is in this book of Revelation. And so when looking at the etymology, we see that it's related to this idea of uncovering. However, with respect to just the general definition or the general understanding of apocalypse, it's referring to this idea of a complete and final destruction of the world, according to this biblical book. And a part of this destruction dynamic involves these four horsemen. Now, there are other entities that are inside of the book of Revelation, and there is a repetitive mention of this construct of a beast of some sort. Okay, and that includes these horses also represent this dynamic of a beast. And so the book of Revelation, this apocalypse, is referring to this idea of destruction or damage that is catastrophic. And so what we're going to do is look at one horse at a time. So we're going to just be looking at one horse and what is riding on this one horse in this narrative. And so if you want to follow along, you can get out your scripture. We are looking at Revelation 6. We're going to look at the New International Version and the KJV. Just to get a better understanding of what's going on here. Now, again, when you look at the English translation, it is not the same as this Greek rendering. And so we're going to be looking at what these words are, these operative words are in the Greek, so that we better understand what's going on with this first horse that we're going to be looking at. And so in the NIV, or the New International Version, it's referring to these seals being removed and opened. And so therefore there's this vision that this John is seeing. And so remember, the book of Revelation is about John having these visions. And so it indicates here that John watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Now, there is an assumption that people are making about this Lamb. And so many individuals are assuming that Lamb corresponds to the entity known as Jesus. However, the Lamb is what is used here. And then it goes on to indicate that John heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." And then after that, John indicates that John looked, and there before him was a white horse. John indicates that the rider held a bow, and the rider was given a crown. And the rider rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Now we're going to be looking at very specific words in this particular description here to get a better understanding of what's going on with the white horse. Now we're going to look at the same passage but in the King James Version. And so in this version, it indicates that John again saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and John heard, as it were, the noise of thunder, one of the 4 beasts saying, "Come and see." It goes on to indicate that John saw and beheld a white horse. And John indicated that he that sat on this horse had a bow and a crown. And it indicates here that this crown was given unto him. However, when looking at the Greek, it doesn't say exactly that. But it goes on to indicate that this entity, this white horse, went forth conquering and to conquer. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at in terms of the scripture related to this white horse. Now, before we get into the exact words that are written, we're going to look at some of the dynamics going on with respect to these representations. Now, with respect to the representation of this white horse, there is a dynamic of deception going on. And so in terms of symbolism, this white horse, based upon what the white horse is carrying, is representing deception. And so this white horse is about some form of deception. Now, what is meant by this? With respect to this white horse, there is the image of what's known as purity and light and all of that. And so you would expect clarity that goes along with this purity. However, this white horse is not bringing purity, goodness, or light. This white horse is actually bringing the antithesis of that. And so when deconstructing what's really going on with this white horse, we see not this clarity, this purity. We see that the white horse is carrying disease, infection, and plague. Now, this is interesting because this is not the way this horse is understood in the deconstructions that you might see related to this particular horse. However, when deconstructing what's going on in the Greek with this particular horse, we see that this horse is carrying something that is not pure and that represents disease and infection or a plague, and that this is a part of this conquering dynamic. So we're going to be looking at specifically what we are talking about. And so the what of this narrative is a horse. And the type of horse is a white horse. We are also looking at what this white horse is possessing or what instrument the white horse is carrying. And so one of the first things we see with this white horse is that in possession of the white horse or on top of the white horse or what the white horse is carrying is this instrument, and the instrument is a bow. However, when we look at the deconstruction of bow, something interesting emerges related to this idea of a bow. The other possession or instrument is a crown. And just like we see with the bow, we are going to see that something interesting emerges related to the crown. However, with respect to the crown, we've already addressed this construct of crown before. And so it should not be a surprise to you when you see what's really going on with this crown construct that is in possession as an instrument dealing with this horse. And also a part of this narrative is an action or purpose of this white horse. And part of the action or purpose of the white horse, the entity that is being carried, there is the action or purpose of conquering or conquest. And so, with respect to the symbolism of the horse is serving as a vehicle. The horse is a conduit. The horse is a conveyance of what the horse is carrying. And so, what we have is the horse is the vehicle for the bow, the crown, and the conquest. And so again, the focus here with respect to this rider is the bow, the crown, and the conquest. Now, before we get into this deconstruction of horse, because that's where we're going to start, we understand that the horse is a vehicle or a conduit. However, the horse is not simply carrying something, but a horse is largely under the direction or the control of the rider or the thing that's being conducted. And so that brings to the forefront the importance of the thing that's being carried. Now, what's noted is in this narrative, this white horse brings conquest and a typical weaponry and we're going to look at this weaponry and this construct of conquest together. Now, of course, many people are going to automatically think that the weaponry is this bow in the traditional sense, this bow that would have arrows to shoot forth at a target. However, there's a little bit more going on with respect to that bow. Now, with respect to a horse, we see here the etymology of horse, which is very interesting, by the way. This horse etymology goes back to the word Ross, as in ROS or ROSS. Okay. And it's related to this idea of running. And here you can see that deconstruction with this Germanic origin relating to the Dutch Ross, ROS. But then interestingly, when it refers to the German Ross, the R is capitalized. And so it's unclear where all of that is coming from because, of course, Ross is a formal surname and it's also associated with people known as Russ. And so you see this Ross and you see this Russ in terms of a correlating construct. What's also interesting is horse has an informal meaning that is related to something that is detrimental. Okay. And so it's related to a drug. And so this horse has a few meanings. But you can also see here how this etymology comes together. And so looking at this old High German, you see Hros, which is HROS. Now in the Greek, the word for horse is hippo, HIPPO, just like hippopotamus. And so a hippopotamus is thought of as a river horse, a water horse. Now, with respect to the white part of the horse, we find this at 3022 in Strong's in the Greek, and we see leukos. And we've already looked at Louis, all of that before, and so it's the same thing here. And so we have leukos, meaning white, and so this is the type of horse. This is the description, the physical description of this horse, meaning white or light. And of course, you recall that Louis, Levi, all of these constructs hang together. And so that's the type of horse this is. This is a Louis horse from Luke or loose. And of course, this adds to the dynamic of the potential for deception because, again, this idea of Luke or loose is tied to, of course, Lucifer. And so this horse basically is a Lucifer horse. And here you can see some of the Greek words that correspond to the English translations. Now we're going to look at this bow that is attached to this horse. And so the horse is carrying an entity that is in possession of a bow. Now, technically, a bow is thought of as an instrument used in warfare or hunting that goes along with an arrow, a projectile. There are a few interesting notations going on here with this. And so the word for bow is at 5115 in Strong's Greek, and the word is taxon. Yes, Toxon. And it actually is related to what you might think it's related to based upon this spelling. And so we're going to look at that. And here we see that this is coming from this base of this idea of giving birth. And if you think about the action of a bow, it is something that brings something forth. It springs something forth. And you see that with the arrow. And so, in that odd way, it is related to this idea of giving birth, bringing something forth. However, there's a little bit more going on with this bow construct. So here we have this bow, this bringing forth. This entity is carrying something that brings forth. However, this word toxon has another etymology dynamic going on. Toxon is the same as toxin. And a toxin, in terms of etymology, is an organic poison. And so this idea of toxon, toxic, these are all related. And this organic poison that represents this toxin is referring to something that is especially produced by bacteria in an animal body. Okay. And so this thing that this entity is carrying on the horse is understood also as a toxin or an organic poison. And so the horse is serving as a conduit, a vehicle for this toxin or this organic poison, the bringing forth. And here you see toxic, pertaining to poisons or something that is poisonous. This is related to the French toxique, directly coming from the Latin toxicus, meaning poisoned. Also from the Greek toxicon, which is pharmakon, pharmakos, poison. Now this is when it gets interesting, because this now relates back to the traditional understanding of bow. And so it is this poison that is used for or used on arrows. And so it is pertaining to toxicos, poisoned arrows, or things with a poison point, a spiky kind of thing. And so pertaining to arrows or archery, going right back to this bow, meaning toxon. And this is considered a loan word from the Scythians or the Scythians. And here are additional Greek words that correspond to the English translations. And here at 4735 in the Greek, we have the Stephanos, and it indicates crown, crowns, wreath. And here you see it again, related to this idea of a badge of royalty. And you can also see that this goes back to Greek 1238. And so here we have additional information related to this Stephanos, this crown. And this word also goes along with the name Stephen or Stephan. Both of those are coming from this construct of a crown. And so it offers here that this is another way of saying encircle something, something that surrounds something, something that goes around something. And again, of course, it is this crown, this wreath that this is referring to, specifically a conqueror's wreath, this sort of laurel wreath that you've seen historically. And the other word for this, and we've looked at this before, is diadema. Okay, so there's a lot going on with respect to this particular construct, this Stephanos. And we're going to look at additional deconstruction related to this particular word. And to gain more clarity, we're going to look at this word in the Old English, and we're also going to look at the Latin meaning of this word, or the Latin translation of this word. And so when we look at this expanded etymology that's offered, just keep in mind that this crown is what this horse is carrying. So this horse, this white horse, is serving as a conduit for this crown. So with respect to this entity that is on this horse, this entity is carrying a bow. And we now know that a bow is another word for toxin, also related to pharmacon. The other thing that this horse is carrying is this crown. In terms of the etymology of crown, the horse is carrying corona. The other word for crown is corona, or wreath. This is a part of the etymology. And so this horse is carrying a toxin, an organic poison, and corona. This is where that saying, truth is stranger than fiction, fits. And here you see additional information related to this crown, this corona, and it indicates a garland worn on the head as a mark of honor or emblem of majesty. It represents a halo and a celestial body. It is the same as crown. And here are the various synonyms for this corona. What's also noteworthy is that that's corona with respect to a noun. However, corona or crown with respect to a verb represents the idea of something culminating, the completion of something, it's the top of something, or the finishing of something. And here you can see the very direct translation coming out of the English crown going into the Latin corona. And here you can see it at Revelation 6:2 coming out of the Greek into the Latin. And you can see over on the right hand side, corona. And here you can see it more clearly at Revelation 6:2 in the Latin is corona. Now let's talk about the purpose or the action of this entity and this horse. And so the purpose or the action of the entity or the horse is this conquering. And so this entity is carrying this toxin, corona, and the purpose or the action of this entity and this white horse The action is to conquer, to overcome, to prevail, to gain a victory. And we see this in Strong's at Nikao. Nikao. It's related to the word Nike. So you've seen Nike before. It's related to that. And so it's related to this idea of victory. And you see that at Greek 35:29. So to look at this idea of this conquering horse and rider, we see that this idea of conquering or conquest refers to the dynamic of subduing something, someone, to overcome, to conquer, to prevail, to get the victory. And so that's the purpose and the action of this particular horse. And here we see additional information about this conquer dynamic, referring to gain or acquiring by force of arms, subjugating, and vanquishing. And so that's what's going on with this horse that's carrying, transporting this organic toxin, poison, and corona, and this dynamic of conquering. And so that's what the horse, the rider, is doing. It is going forth to conquer and focused on conquering. So subjugating, vanquishing. And here we have additional etymology information with conquering, again referring to this idea of acquiring something. And here are additional synonyms for this conquer dynamic. And so we have conquer, vanquish, defeat, subdue, reduce, overcome, and overthrow. And with respect to vanquish, it's referring to this idea of overcoming some entity in battle and completely subduing the entity. And so this white horse is carrying this organic poison, toxin, corona, and this horse is bent on conquering and subduing, or this rider on the horse is bent on that. Now, of course, some people will be quick to draw a connection between this bow and crown in this vision and what has taken place with respect to this pandemic. However, I caution you about drawing those conclusions. This is one of those situations wherein correlation does not necessarily indicate causation, meaning this prophecy or this vision being the catalyst for what has taken place. Sometimes what we are seeing with respect to what looks like prophecy is more of a plan, or it's not organic. And we're going to look at a few dynamics related to this situation that point to it not being completely organic. Now, clearly, when looking at this construct of bow, we do see the relationship between a bow in the book of Revelation, this toxon, and the corona. And so just like with the bow, we see this thing that is related to a spike and something that is piercing. And so that spike protein. We also see that this virus is also a toxin. And if you recall, in terms of etymology, virus is related to or just another word for poison. We also see with respect to Bo and this toxin, this corona, that the corona has been implicated in infection and causing disease. Now, what's noteworthy about this particular virus is that this was not really the pandemic that it was presented as. It was extremely endemic. And so you saw a high occurrence in the United States for some strange reason, and even in mainland America. And so that's something to consider because you didn't see the same dynamics across the globe. You didn't see this going on in other places around the world, not to the extent that we saw here in America. Now, of course, there are some questions about the science that was going on during the height of this endemic pandemic. Now, the other thing that we see with respect to this toxin is that there has been research indicating that this spike protein is a toxin. It can serve as a viral toxin that exacerbates the actual infection. But there also are indications that there was a concerted effort to tie this virus to this crown construct, to tie this virus to a number of constructs. And so it was given the name corona because there was the indication, according to the narrative, that it resembled a crown. Now you can see the depictions of the virus to the left, and then you see the crown to the right. And clearly, this thing does not really resemble a crown. Even if you turn the crown upside down and you look at it from different angles and you look at this virus from different angles, if you see the actual virus in real time, you see that it definitely does not look like a crown. However, there has been this concerted effort to make this connection, to have this thing identified with the construct of a crown, with the construct of a head. And it is not missed that this corona, this head, is also another word for more. And then, even with this acronym, this SARS acronym, which in many ways refers to this idea of a crown again, a prince, a princess, a ruler. And not only that, SAR can also refer to this idea of rebellion or fighting. And so there's a lot going on here. What makes this questionable is that this effort to create this little acronym here is inconsistent with the diagnostic dynamic. What we see with the diagnostic dynamic related to SARS-CoV is that, first of all, it's not always severe. Some people did not know that they even had it until they were tested. The other thing is that it's not always acute. The other thing is that it's not always respiratory limited. And so it's not just in and of itself this severe acute respiratory syndrome. It is something else. However, this name, along with that corona, was given to this particular microbial entity. Now, again, some people will see this as a natural outgrowth of what they see is a prophecy coming out of the book of Revelation. Now, I'm not going to debate about that, but I will point out that this corona also has some lab relationship. There are suggestions that this corona is a result of what is known as gain of function. And so there's no reliable proof right now to indicate that this was a natural evolution, this microbe. And so, therefore, it does bring up a number of questions about the extent to which this thing is not a naturally occurring thing. And so, with respect to prophecy, I guess one could argue that it doesn't really matter whether it is lab related or part of natural evolution. However, this is important to point out because in some instances, people are trying to bring about prophecy. They want to make prophecy real. They want to make these visions real. And so they feel like they need to help it along. And we see this in a number of instances, but that also might be a part of what has gone on with respect to this, because many people did draw connections between this corona and the book of Revelation and some other prophetic works. And these are some resources you can look at wherein there are discussions about this microbe and gain of function. And one of the main things pointed out is that this particular microbe is chimeric. Again, it's like a cat dog. It has these components of different things that make it very unusual. Again, speaking to the likelihood that this thing is not organic. It is not something that is naturally occurring. And also, there was already research going on related to this, trying to make this thing more infectious for humans. Again, speaking to this thing not being natural, this thing being man or human induced or encouraged. And here is another source speaking to the question of gain of function and laboratory manipulation. And this article also speaks to this dynamic of a chimera. And here are additional questions related to recombination and this particular microbe. And this article even points out that this type of research has been going on since at least 2007. It's probably been going on longer than that. However, this is what we have recorded here. And it indicates here, as early as 2007, a group from Wuhan Institute of Virology created a series of Batman CoV chimeric spike proteins to enable the coronaviruses to jump from one species to another. As an aside, it's an interesting notation that Batman is about a collective of criminal psychopaths. And it's also pointed out here that there was a grant made, an NIH grant made of $3.7 million from NIH in 2015 to support this type of research at Wuhan. And so this type of research was funded by US tax dollars to engage in this type of research to create these types of chimeric cat dog microbes. And so again, this speaks to this thing not being completely organic. Now, there is mention of this particular research head being associated with a particular administration. However, this particular research head has been involved in this type of research and heading up funding initiatives prior to this administration or the most recent administrations. And so this entity has been around for a while. And here you have additional information related to the lineage, the ancestry of this particular microbe. And another noteworthy dynamic is this scientific prophecy that has taken place. And so there was the assertion that during a particular administration, the administration wherein this coronavirus arose, there was a prophecy by the research head, NIH, that a particular administration would be facing an infectious disease outbreak and that it would be a surprise. And here you can see that this person was heading up this type of research for over 3 decades. And so this isn't related to a specific administration with respect to this prophetic scientist. And here you have the special one indicating that not only will there be the standard global health challenges, but during a particular administration, the one wherein this coronavirus arose, there would be a surprise disease outbreak. Well, that's certainly some vision. And here we have the quote about definitely getting a surprise in the next few years and indicating that the risks have never been higher. Now, there was also another oddity going on with all of this, and it's related to this quarter that was released in 2020. So, going right along with this SARS-CoV bat coronavirus, we have this bat quarter, very unusual quarter, but released simultaneously with these assertions about this finding of this coronavirus and this initiation of what might be a pandemic. And so, again, it's important to keep in mind with respect to these prophecies, sometimes you have entities, and I mean various entities, that are very invested in creating these dynamics that appear to be bringing forth the prophecy or proving the prophecy. And this might be an instance of that type of dynamic. Well, this wraps up our brief examination of one of the four horses, the white horse. We will be looking at these other horses subsequent to this and doing an examination, and these other horses and their riders are equally interesting. So we have that fiery reddish horse and the black horse and the green horse or the pale horse that we have started discussing. Thank you again for joining us.